how are we maybe rethinking our internal operations? And then maybe we can just start with that, because then I also think it'd be interesting to talk about how content marketing might change, or how content marketers should maybe shift their thinking. But like, what are we doing differently?
I think for internal operations, at least for me, it's getting a lot more ruthless of like, if I have a bunch of admin work, I'm going to figure out how to automate as much of that as possible, or just not do those, like whatever's not important. I think for the team, I can't speak for the rest of the team, but I'm starting to pay a lot more attention. Like, hey, is that like, do we need to do that? Or can we automate that? Mm-hmm. And encouraging the team to think more in that way versus like, if there's ever any sort of annoyance of, oh, I got to do this thing, my immediate question is, let's figure out how to automate it. Or like, mm-hmm. do you even need to do that? So I'd rather we spend a larger percentage of our time on revenue earning and revenue retaining activities than busy work.
Mm-hmm. Busy work and experimental stuff that's like just a loose hypothesis. I think now is maybe not the time for us to invest in like things that are less proven. Like we were talking about paid ads, and there is surely a way to make that work for us. And we just maybe don't have the internal experience to do that. So it's like, how much money do we want to spend and potentially waste learning to get to that point where it's viable, versus like, we know we have a couple channels, and like, why don't we just continue doubling down on those as we could just like squeeze more results. And we know that it's going to be a feasible thing.
Yeah, something that it's been fun to talk about is like how to get the most, like you said, how to get the most out of all of our efforts. So spending time on a podcast and being able to repurpose it for other things, using it for blog content instead of investing in additional blog content that kind of satisfies this podcast, spending time on here and the content that comes from this satisfies our goals in that respect, instead of kind of layering on other efforts. That would be great to have. Let's say if we're not in a recession, but right now that might be something that's 100% not necessary. So I know I've had to hone my skill of like what's necessary and what's not, kind of that same thing you say, Alex, on what moves the boat forward. So really being able to double down on the things that we're already doing, making sure that we get the most out of everything and get the most out of every person we work with too. So it's been fun to check in with some of my team to be like, what else are you interested in? Like, what else would you like to do across the organization? Like, what have you witnessed? What have you gotten to see in other meetings that you might be curious about learning or honing those skills? So really helping them not only feel more value in their role, but also learning what other talents they have that might benefit the growth of the company too.
That's a really good point. Doubling down on investment into employee skill development right now. Mm-hmm. That seems like, I mean, I don't know if I've heard that talked about a lot in terms of like what to do in a recession, but it seems like maximizing somebody's current capabilities versus the risk of hiring maybe new people to satisfy those things. Like how much, could we put somebody through training to learn a new technical SEO skill set versus trying to get some contractor in to satisfy that? That's a really interesting point.
Yeah. And not doing so in a way of squeezing out every working hour, but more helping them become more valuable in their own right as well, because they're not going to go out and invest in $1,000 courses right now, and so we have a lot that we can teach and we can learn from them, and they're obviously curious about other parts of the business. We're, like we said, very transparent, very open, try to avoid silos, so it's a natural next step for us, especially right now.
I go back to the same frameworks that I've talked about probably many times before, but the will it move the boat faster is something I think about a lot in our business, but also personally. I know that as soon as I went full time, many times in my life, I've tried to do calendar audits and energy audits and sit on Sundays and figure out what my most important activities are. And that's been marginally helpful through, just my life. Things build up, you get kind of like calendar debt and whatnot. But when I dropped everything and started working on this full time, I didn't even need to audit it. Like everything just honed in, my vision narrowed, and I knew exactly what I needed to be doing at all times. Like I could feel it when I was like, this isn't the highest impact thing. Like, and David and I talked about that with different meetings that were like very low probability of being anywhere near interesting. We just dropped them. So I think that was one thing that became apparent more so when I went full time. But that's something I continue to think about. And then, like, one of my favorite business books recently is Amp It Up. I love that book. And I know it's kind of controversial, but only because he wrote that essay on LinkedIn in 2020 or 2021 when it was the height of just like, forgive me that this maybe is controversial, but entitlement in the tech space, like including myself, like we were all making tons of money and like the RSUs were insane. There was no shortage of demand for your skills. So you could just hop to another company, double your fucking salary. And it became so bloated and so soft. And what's the guy's name who wrote Amp It Up?
Frank
Slootman. He comes out and writes this essay that's like, increase the urgency and velocity, like go way faster than you think you're going to the point where you're uncomfortable. Narrow the focus, which I don't think that was controversial, but like do fewer things better and like raise the standards. Like it's either totally amazing or total shit. Like, and those things, like I remember there was so many comments just blasting him for this, but I bet those founders and the people blasting it back then, now and in the next 2 years are going to be like, oh shit, those are pretty good operating principles. I always think about those too. And those are important in the off season, but they're also important, in war times.
Yeah, I think a heuristic that I got from the My First Million podcast around hiring was sort of like, you want to hire someone that's going to fall into 3 buckets. They're either going to be a rock star at the company and like really grow and like you can coach them and get them to like amazing levels. They're going to grow and they're going to outgrow the company and decide to leave and go do their own thing, which is fine too. Or they're okay and you just fire them. So far, I don't think we've had any of the 3rd bucket. And I think we have more in like the 1st bucket. 2nd bucket, I don't think we can make a judgment call on that yet.
Buckets? It was rock stars and then
rock star, someone who outgrows the company.
Oh yeah. Okay, I thought those were the same kind of.
Or like, there's no room for like, oh, they're good, they're fine, but we can coach them up. It's like, no, they're either like already great and we continue leveling them up, or we don't stick with it and we just have the hard conversation.
Yeah, the okay ones, that seems more like a role for like maybe a mercenary or contractor if you really just need to get something done. But for the people who are on the boat, like, or what's the metaphor that I think Frank Slootman talked about, like drivers versus passengers? Like you don't want passengers, like they tend to weigh down the ship, and you want people who are driving it forward.
Yeah.
But a lot of that is like the tone that we strike, right? In terms of focus, like I think that's one of the big things in setting the tempo for how fast we expect to get things done. Standards, I think we've already set very high standards for the work quality that we put out for clients, especially, but then our own internal stuff as well. But I would say like in the past few months, we've tried to shift the focus to much more narrow. Like, hey, what are the few things that we can really knock out of the park and just forget about the rest? We stopped investing in YouTube. I stopped working with the LinkedIn agency, and we're pouring it all into events, like bottom funnel blog posts, and basically the podcast. And the tempo, I would say we've also tried to push that forward. Like instead of, hey, come up with this full plan in a month and like, get every detail right. It's like, what can we have done by today or tomorrow? Or like, it doesn't have to be the whole thing, but how can we get some momentum here?
Yeah, I think we could be doing that more. To be honest, I partially feel that for myself, and maybe because I feel that for myself, I feel it for their team too, that we could probably amp it up a little bit more, knowing that there's probably some boundaries with like personal stuff going on and all that stuff. But I think there's room for us to drive a bit more urgency and amp it up some more.
I think people misunderstand those principles too, and they think it's somehow conflicted with work-life balance. But I actually think that it promotes a better work-life balance because you end up like pouring more intensity into your work and spending maybe even less time doing it. Because oftentimes, like when I'm most stressed out, it's when I spend these days kind of uncoordinated. When I've got like a bunch of meetings that I kind of don't know the agenda for, but I'm sitting in, like maybe they're not super important. When I've got 20 things on my to-do list and they're all marginally important, and I'm like waiting to email somebody back for some reason, like I could just fire off like a 1-minute response. And then it's like the days where I just crush through it in a couple hours and like I'm really sprinting at it. And I'll often finish early, but it's like I feel better those days and I actually have more time for the quote unquote life side of the equation.
Honestly, for me, I've always struggled with having speed and standards go hand in hand because I often overthink when it comes to something having to be perfect. I mean, you all know I struggle with perfection. And when I hear high quality, high standards, like that's kind of what I hear as a synonym, which it's not a synonym because perfection is literally impossible. But I've always struggled with that. And I've realized like there is such thing as just caring too much. There's a point of diminishing returns when it comes to how much you think about a project or think about an email response or think about anything. And over time, no more thinking, no more waiting is going to make whatever you're trying to do better. And so for me, like my best days are when I just literally get shit done. And I kind of don't care. I mean, y'all know it's pretty impossible for me not to care about something, but I'm trying to reach a point of apathy that I don't cut corners, I don't do poor work or anything, but I don't know, there's a little bit of power to apathy, especially right now when you're just overwhelmed with everything going on in the world. Like you have to let go a little bit mentally. Like you can't care 100% about 100% of what's in your mind. And I think that's helped me with work, like moving faster and maintaining quality is not only letting go of a little of that, but also like trusting my gut, trusting that like that stuff, that quality, that those standards are going to come out in my work naturally because of how hard I work and how hard I try to be perfect. But it's always been a struggle for me to have, amp it up, go fast, go hard, high standards. It's for me, it's like, God, standards take time, but that's not always true.
And it's like, what standards really matter and what standards can you actually like somewhat forget about? Letting the small fires burn is what I say. Because sometimes, like, I know, for instance, with experimentation or in sales, quantity has a quality all of its own. Like David, you were just talking about like baseline, maybe we get a 5% conversion rate if we're doing outbound sales. Well, that means we got to send a lot of emails. And experiments, it's hard to predict what's going to win. So actually, if you can lower the cost of experimentation and put some urgency behind it, you might have a less high quality experiment each time. But like over time, because you're putting out more at bats or shots on goal, you're actually going to come up with a better, higher ROI program just through the sheer quantity of doing so, as opposed to sitting in a committee room arguing about which font is actually the best one instead of just fucking testing it.
Right.
It's like writing output. Like I've gotten more comfortable with this, that nothing I write is going to be perfect. Like I'm about to publish something and I don't feel great about it, but I'm like, this gets the message across and it's some great learnings and it'll be nice to get it published. Is it going to be my best writing? Probably not. But if I tried to do my best writing on every piece, I would be spending like 50 hours per article.
No one ever read it. Yeah. It's
interesting too, because like no one's going to know that like it's not your best work. So I was in band in middle school and I was around all the recitals I used to do. I was on the first chair flute, always had the solos, and I'd always mess something up, right? And my mom's like, you couldn't tell. No one can tell. And part of me was like, but I care. But at the end of the day, it's like, I shouldn't care. I did my best. I showed up and the audience loved it. And that's all that really matters. And maybe in the back of your mind, you're like, that could have been better, but like, who cares? Like you got it out there and it got the message across. So I'm speaking about a strong grip on this and I don't have a strong grip on this. I don't know.
No, that's good. Most people don't notice those things. Like David, the Will Smith book that you recommended me, there was that part where he talked about how he was so nervous about some of the Fresh Prince stuff when he first started that he would memorize everyone's lines and start like mouthing them, even though like these people were like world-class actors. And he's like, you can still see it if you watch some of the early episodes, but I can't remember the name of the effect, whatever cognitive bias, it's some like focus effect or something like that. But you're watching the person who's speaking, so you don't even notice Will Smith mouthing the words to their parts while he's speaking.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting.
Wait, speaking on, I just spoke about writing. Alex, you had some things to say about how content and SEO might change in a recession environment.
Well, I don't know necessarily the answers. So that's maybe where we open it up to a debate or conversation. My hypothesis would be that similar things apply to content that they do on a business level and a marketing level, which is like, you're going to cut some budget, you're going to trim down. I think one thing is like, we've gotten used to paying like, like top prices for almost all things in content, whether it's video, podcast production, the writing, the editing, and maybe you start to question like, where are the biggest impact levers and how can I double down on those? And like, if you're going to double down on those, you have a finite budget. So like, what do you have to cut? And I don't think the answer is the same for every company. That's where the kind of nuance lies. It's like, whatever's working for your company is probably what you should double down on. If you were experimenting with some thought leadership and that's very expensive and you're printing money from bottom funnel SEO stuff, I don't know, maybe like double down on that, maybe work on content optimization and figure out how much you can squeeze out of the low hanging fruit of the stuff you've already published. Yeah. But I don't know. What do y'all think?
Well, I think it's more important than ever for content teams to understand how their efforts are impacting revenue. And I don't think every team has mapped that out. I think there's some parts of it that may be assumed. Maybe some GA goals show some progress in that respect, but I don't know if everyone can can tell, their higher ups or their leaders, like, this is exactly what we're doing to drive revenue. This part might not be working, or maybe we're experimenting on this part, but X, Y, Z are how we make the business money. So I think that bridging that gap or drawing that line is probably an important step one that would then inform what Alex said, which is like what to keep pushing, what to maybe shelve for the time being, maybe to what to do away with altogether and pick back up in a couple of years, or depending on how the business changes.
Yeah, when I'm just gonna think out loud, but I just think about some of the clients and people I've spoken to is first it starts with how the business views content. Like some businesses or VPs of marketing might be like, it's just a traffic growth thing, but not be mapping it down to how it generates leads and all that. And some might be doing that, which is probably good. And then others might also be thinking about content more holistically of, yeah, it brings in traffic, but we also use it for sales enablement. And we also use like the case studies a lot in our paid ads, and our paid ads are performing well. So we might decrease the budget for content, but we're not going to cut it out. So there's definitely a spectrum. And I think the way we pitch our services is, hey, we're growing traffic that's relevant. So even though it doesn't immediately convert now, and there will be some traffic that does convert, like this is all going to be relevant to your buyer persona. So unless if you're completely pivoting your product or company, this should all be relevant even 1, 2, 3 years from now, ideally. And we're going to build out the reporting so you see what the impact is on leads, if that's their goal. And we're seeing some clients where like content is starting to hockey stick their product signups and trials started and all that, which is great. So hopefully they don't want to decrease their budgets on that. But there might be some who maybe they went in expecting an immediate return and not seeing it, and they're deciding to cut the budget. So I'm just mapped out a bunch of different scenarios. What I would encourage like VPs of marketing right now is, if all the other SaaS companies are laying off and cutting budgets, you should probably have to make a call on whether you also want to do that, or while people are starting to get a bit more defensive, you go on the offense and like start building your moat. I don't think it's an easy decision, but some I have to get more comfortable with in a recession, continuing to take a long game approach versus short-term cuts. Mm-hmm. And there's no right answer. I wouldn't know what to do.
The heuristic of, when people are greedy, stay fearful, and vice versa, how does that trickle down to apply to how content is a long game? Do you stay greedy investing in something that might not see returns for a year? It's going to be a long year.
Well, so there's a bit of research on that, and it's a little frustrating because we're kind of talking about performance marketing versus brand marketing to an extent. If it's performance marketing, you can kind of tie that back pretty quickly. And I do think, like, regardless of what you do, you should have a content growth model and be able to explain how content's contributing to the business. Like, that's just core level one. And then that allows you to like basically see, all right, if it's generating this business, like how, and like, how can I like double down on that? And what things can I cut out? That's core stuff. But I read an article on Marketing Week. It was from Mark Ritson. And it's kind of frustrating because he actually doesn't link to the research. He just kind of summarizes it, which I found frustrating just editorially. But he talked about like the spending during a recession. And he actually says that contrary to what you would think, performance budgets should be cut before brand budgets. And again, I didn't see the research, so I can't vet him on this, and I'm a little skeptical. But his whole thing was, I have the quote actually, if your category cuts half its ad spend and you maintain your ad spend, for example, you get a massive boost in your ESOV, earned share of voice, share of voice, simply because everyone else is investing relatively less. And if multiple industries cut back their spending as they do in a recession, the cost of media often drops, ensuring your relative big ad spend is now stretching to even more value. So I think that's the fearful when others are greedy. Those are the benefits there. Or sorry, greedy when others are fearful, is that it costs less in content. It might cost less to hire writers. It might cost less to do the certain things, especially paid budgets. Like you're going to get better CPMs and CPC. And then he also talked about this. It's summarizing a century of data, which is annoying because he didn't actually link to the century of data. The reasons brands should maintain their brand building budgets in a recession is not because of the recession itself, nor the behaviors of consumers. It's because your competitors lose their nerve and are vulnerable because of it. So if you can keep your head and your brand budget around while those around you are reducing theirs, you'll earn post-recessionary benefits. So he is directly speaking to the value of the long game there.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me of what David said about that poll that was taken at that event.
Mm-hmm. Well, and at that event, like I would hypothesize that because they're listeners of the All In podcast, they're a little bit sharper. They know these things. And I would say that's probably not reflective of the general market.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of fearful people too.
It sounds like the article you're talking about, Alex, I looked it up. It looks like it's talking more about, in this case, probably CPG, like consumer companies.
He's focused on consumers.
Yeah, sure. I can see where brand makes sense. And I think how that translates to us in like B2B is in B2B, people are also be cutting spend. So for us, while other agencies might be cutting spend, how do we continue getting in front of our prospective buyers regularly more than those other agencies? And for our clients, how do they continue getting that share of voice while their competitors are kind of slowing it down a little bit? So I wouldn't even correlate it to spend, like though that's one channel, but like for us, we're going to be doubling down on events, and we want everyone that would want to work with us or like be interested in learning about B2B demand gen to attend this event, while other people might be decreasing budgets and all of that.
Yeah. I mean, we have two poles of our strategy in regards to marketing and sales. And one is very like direct response, one-to-one sales outreach and referrals and whatnot, where we're essentially just trying to find the right person at the right company at the right time. And the other side is all brand building. Like that's what we do with the podcast, brand building and community. And that's what we do with the office hours and the road to mastery and like the event series. Like, so I think, I mean, we're already doubling down on both of those. That's the thing is we're just trying to figure out like what the right allocation is among those activities, right? Because YouTube would have been brand building as well. It wasn't as propitious. So we decided to chop that. Whereas like the event series, we're like, all right, we're already seeing results from this. We know we can double down on this. This can get us closer to our target market. So let's invest more. Another thing that marketers should do, by the way, and this ties into the analytics side of things, is I don't think anybody can predict very accurately how consumer behavior changes, except that it will. So that's one thing that's interesting in that you kind of have to wear a couple different hats. We've already talked about how content marketers need to learn how to, tie back their efforts to results and maybe build some sort of a content growth model, or at least do some attribution to figure that out. That's skill set number one. But number two is learning how to do that customer research, customer insights, voice of customer research to figure out like, how are your customers feeling? Are they fearful? Are they increasing their budgets? Are they decreasing their budgets? That's especially true in SaaS and B2B. And I think a lot of companies are already doing that, thankfully, but a lot of that should be housed in the content program itself. Because I know a lot of the times it's housed in product or potentially a conversion rate optimization in UX. But how you write the content should potentially shift depending on how your buyers are speaking about their feelings at the moment.